almost at 9:15, so I think we're going to go ahead and start. So welcome everyone to the first seminar of the Global Summer Institute at EquiTech Futures. It's my great pleasure to welcome a dear friend of mine, Indrajeet Patil, who is a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, where he works at the Center for Humans and Machines, this new research center, which is looking at the interface between artificial intelligence, machine learning, and human ethics. And Indra and I have, Indra is what we all call him, and we have been friends for 15 years now. We've known each other for 15 years now. We met, we were in the same program at the University of Pune, where we studied physics. Indra, like me, studied physics for his master's program, but went on to change tracks and got a PhD in cognitive neuroscience at the School of International Studies called CISA in Trieste in Italy. And after doing some really interesting work on social neuroscience and morality, he moved to Harvard, where he was a postdoc at the Department of Psychology. And after that has now moved to Berlin in Germany to be a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute. And I really thought it would be super interesting to have Indra, who not only has a super interdisciplinary approach to thinking about lots of these problems at the intersection of technology, science, technology, and society, but also has kind of used cool new technology tools to investigate some of these questions. And as we are going as we are talking about artificial intelligence and the implications of artificial intelligence, I think it's important to hear from practitioners and researchers who kind of really at the forefront of this field, and Indra is one of them. So I'm really happy that everyone at the summer school gets to hear from him and interact with him. I should also mention, I'll be really remiss if I did not mention that another thing that Indra is really passionate about and has been a great advocate for has been open source software. He is an extremely well-known and well-appreciated open source R developer. He develops a lot of statistical packages for statistical analysis in R. Has a lot of interesting insights on data visualization that I go back to him from time to time to get his insight on, and was really helpful for Bhasi and me when we were developing the data science course. So thank you, Indra, for that. Really appreciate that. And so with that, I will let Indra start.
Hey, everyone. Thanks, Abhilash, for the glowing introduction. I'm really happy to talk to all of you. As Abhilash mentioned, I'm currently in Berlin as a postdoc, but I'll actually be soon changing my track completely and starting to work as a software engineer. So this is kind of my swan song, and I'm really happy to share it with you. I just wanted to turn off the share screen because I can't really see any faces. So I just wanted to, look at the crowd, and feel free to drop any questions that you might have in the chat, and then we can get to them at the end of the talk. All right. So I can share my screen now. I hope everything looks good. Cool. So I wanted to talk to you today about some of the interesting ways that moral psychologists have found to study human morality. But before we move to that, we now live in an age of machines where people have really started to ask questions about how should we morally evaluate artificial intelligence machines or algorithms. And this keeps coming up in different contexts. So for example, as self-driving cars hit the road, we will be confronted as a society to decide how these cars should be distributing risks. So in a situation like this, should the risk be distributed more towards someone who is a bicyclist or someone who is in the car? Now, this may seem like trivial, but over millions of cars and over millions of miles driven by cars, such small preferences can add up to different casualty rates for different modes of transportation. So how should we decide? How should we make ethical choices in cases like this? And of course, the choices we make will be programmed into the software that goes into such cars. We have more interesting problems also in the ethics of art. We now have AI algorithms that can generate art. So how should we give credit when algorithms create art? Should we praise the AI if it comes up with a masterpiece? And should we also blame the AI if it actually reproduces copyrighted material? These are really interesting questions, and we don't really have a good answers right now. We also have AIs that can play games. How should we evaluate behaviors like this? And we also have AIs that are involved in our justice systems. For example, across many states in US, AI algorithms are used to decide who gets parole and who doesn't. Now, how trustworthy should these decisions be? Is there any inherent bias in these decisions that is introduced due to the underlying data? Now, to understand and to answer all the questions that come when we have to evaluate whether a behavior from a machine or from an algorithm is good or bad, we first have to understand how human beings actually decide what is right and what is wrong. And that's where I come in. So before we even begin to study AI ethics, we have a long history of studying morality in human beings themselves. So in my research, at least during my PhD, I spent a lot of time thinking about why people feel morally conflicted, how do they resolve such moral conflicts, and why there is no moral consensus. So why is it that people don't agree with each other when it comes to situations which are morally difficult? And I will give you an example in a second. So I'll have two parts to this talk. One is about using novel methods from virtual reality, and then I'll also talk about how we can use some of the traditional methods to understand human morality. So we'll start with sacrificial dilemmas and virtual reality, and I'll just explain what I mean by that in a moment. So when moral psychologists have tried to study human morality in lab settings, they have faced with a problem. Like it's very difficult to create situations in lab settings where someone can be put in a position to be harmed, because that is a complete ethical no-go for any review board. So how do moral psychologists actually study harm in lab settings? And one of the tools that they have borrowed from philosophers is using what are called moral dilemmas. So dilemmas are situations where there is no right answer. So have a look at this classic moral dilemma called trolley dilemma, where the situation is something like this. There is an out of control trolley which is about to run over 5 people if the person near the switch doesn't do anything. And if he lets the trolley run over the 5 people, but by not doing anything, it is called a non-utilitarian choice. While if the person actually switches the track, there is only one person on the other track, and the trolley will run over this person. So effectively by switching, the person will save 5 people, but sacrifice 1 person. And this is, philosophers call this a utilitarian action. And basically what it means is utilitarianism proposes that all those actions are good, that maximizes welfare for maximum number of people. So given that net 4 lives are saved, this is considered a utilitarian choice. And so this is one instance where psychologists have used these hypothetical situations to investigate what people think about situations like this. So note that this is a hypothetical scenario. Of course, people don't really have any familiarity with these kinds of vignettes, and that's the strength of them, because that means we can tap into the untrained intuitions of what people think about situations like this. So let me for a second stop. And if you were to face a situation like this, how many of you will switch the trolley?
So I guess in the, so we should, what we should do is say +1 if you're going to switch the trolley in the chat.
Yeah, okay. So you can leave the responses there and I'll come back and check later on. All right, so this is what you say you will do, okay? And this is how psychologists have traditionally studied these choices. So the extant literature in psychology is pretty much self-report. So it studies what people say they would do, but not actually what they do. And this is where novel method like virtual reality comes in, because the utility of virtual reality is that it's an interactive, highly naturalistic, and contextually rich sensory stimuli. Now, why should we have such a rich stimuli? Because when we ask people about situations as emotionally charged as this one in a text format, they don't really have access to the motivationally salient cues which are present when they are faced with situations like this. And providing them with rich virtual environments actually counteracts that problem. So the aim of this study was to figure out whether hypothetical judgments actually translate into behavior. And the design for the study looked something like this. So we had 40 participants who came in 2 different sessions. So in one session, participants did a virtual reality task, and in the other session, they did the same task. That is, they faced the same scenarios, but in writing. So it was a text-based format presentation. And of course, it was randomized. And while they did so, we also monitored their skin conductance, which is kind of an indirect index of how emotionally aroused they were when facing these situations. I would like to show now the exact stimuli that we use, but I should warn that they're rather graphic. So if you're uncomfortable with that, feel free to look away and I'll say you when to look back. So I'm gonna have to go to YouTube. So as you can see here, you are faced with the same scenario where there's a trolley which is going to run over 5 people and you have to change. Here it's 5 people who need to be saved from sharks. All right, so you can look back again if you had turned away. So those were the virtual reality dilemmas that we used. As you can see, they are pretty graphic
today after doing the same.
Oops.
Indeed, here comes Anisa Mohammed starting over number 6.
Sorry about that. So as you can see, the dilemmas were extremely graphic. They provided the full context of the situation, and in situations like this, participants had to actually behave and not just tell you what they think they would do. And our prediction was that, of course, the virtual reality dilemmas will be more emotionally arousing, which would play into their behavior. And we will see that there is a difference between how they say they would behave and how they actually behave. And what do we see? On here, y-axis, you see skin conductance response. And on the x-axis, we see the actual condition that the participants were in. So if you look at the text presentation of the scenarios, you can see that there is barely any emotional response when participants read about such emotionally distressing scenarios. And that's the whole point of using virtual reality, because it's giving you the context which is absent in text-based situations. So here you can see that in actual experimental condition, participants are more emotionally aroused as compared to control condition. I did not show control videos, but control videos were basically videos where there was no conflict. So basically, participants had to switch the train, for example, on another track, but there was no one on another track. So it's not a dilemma because you basically have to just save someone. And of course, the difference between these differences was also significant. And if we look at the actual choices that people made, in text-based scenarios, people said that 76% of the time they would like to switch the train. That is, they would like to save more number of people, that they would like to make more utilitarian choice. But when they were presented with the exact same situations in virtual reality, 95% of them switched. So this validates our hypothesis that when the same situations are presented in more emotionally engaging situations, the people do not stick by their original hypothetical decisions. And this is just one scenario. We wanted to see if we can replicate the same pattern with a completely different context. Now, while thinking about the previous scenario, if you thought that this is highly unlikely, this is not the kind of dilemmas we face on a daily basis, the kind of dilemmas, and you'll be right, like the kind of dilemmas that we typically face on a daily basis is when our own welfare is pitted against somebody else's welfare, right? So should you give up your seat for an elderly lady on a bus? Should you give us some money so that someone else can benefit from it? And these are called altruistic dilemmas. So we also wanted to see if we can replicate the same kind of decision, same kind of response pattern with a different kind of dilemma, because the previous one was a sacrificial dilemma, and now we will see an altruistic dilemma. So we call this task an extreme altruism task. And here again, we had the same kind of setup where people did, although different groups of people did a virtual reality task in an MRI scanner, and the same task, but in a written format in text. Once again, if you are not comfortable watching emotionally distressing material, I just wanted to give a warning, and we will see this link on YouTube. Okay, I should give some context. So basically, the task was that participants were told that they would have to evacuate a building in an emergency setting. And you will see some instructions, but that's all in Italian, so feel free to ignore this. This study was conducted in Italy, so we've tried to follow like the regulations in Italy. And as you can see here, there is energia vitale, which is like, how much energy is left in your character. And you basically have to exit the building before this drops to 0. And that's your job.
Attenzione, è scoppiato un incendio. Evacuare l'edificio al più presto seguendo le segnaletiche di emergenza. Attenzione, è scoppiato un incendio. Evacuare l'edificio al più presto seguendo le segnaletiche di emergenza.
And this was the key task. The participants had no idea that they were going to come across an individual who is going to need their help. And so what we were interested in is how people would behave. As you can see that they have very little life left, and now they have to decide whether to save this person or save themselves. And that's what I mean by this is an altruistic dilemma, where their own welfare is pitted against someone else's.
Sono ferito, aiutami, ti prego. Aiutami, sono bloccato. Sposta l'armadio, ti prego.
So that was an example of an altruistic behavior. So we recorded this for participants, and that was a participant who actually stopped and decided to help. And this is an example of non-altruistic behavior where the person actually, saved themselves.
Sono ferito, aiutami, ti prego. Aiutami, sono bloccato. Sposta l'armadio, ti prego.
So as you can imagine, these were really engaging scenarios for the participants, and they did this while they were in an MRI scanner. So it was a very immersive experience for them. And so our prediction was that people who read the situation in text-based settings would say that they would be altruistic. And that is exactly what we see. If people read the situation and we ask them, what would you do? 91% of them say that they would stop and try to help the person. But if you look at their actual behavior in virtual reality, this drops to 65%, which is still not bad, but it's still impressive that there is such a reduction in responses just by changing or just by making the stimuli more emotionally engaging and more contextually rich. I'll just talk about this. If you don't understand this, just ignore it. But we also had some hypothesis about whether people who stop and help and those who do not help, whether there will be some structural differences in the brains of these people. And we used a method called deformation-based morphometry. And what we basically find is that people who are altruists, what we call extreme altruists, because they're putting their lives at risk in the situations, have an enlarged right anterior insula, which is a part of the brain which is involved in other-oriented empathetic emotions, etc. So to conclude, based on these two studies, we can say that social decision-making assessment should utilize more contextually salient and ecologically valid methods. And this is because when we are faced with morally charged situations in abstract text-based format, we actually do not have access to what is motivationally important for us when we make such choices in real life. And the virtual reality methods might be an imperfect solution in the right direction. In the next part, I would like to talk about how we can also use some of the traditional biomarker methods to study human morality. So far I have talked about first person decision-making. So the person is asked, what would you do if you were in a situation like this? But there are also situations where we are asked as a third party, what would you do or how would you judge about someone else's behavior? So for example, when third party harm happens, it looks something like this. There is a violator and there is a victim. So for example, there is an accident and now you're part of the jury who has to decide, how much blame should be given to the person who was involved in the accident, right? And you have a violator, someone who caused the accident, and then you have a victim who was hurt in the accident. So when we try to understand situation like this, there are two different psychological capacities that we use. One is called a theory of mind, which is basically our ability to represent somebody else's epistemic state, basically what they believed, what they desired, what they knew, etc. So for example, if you see an accident, you might ask, well, what was the person thinking when they did that? On the other hand, you also have our ability to empathize, which is to represent and share someone else's feelings. And using that, we can try to understand, well, how did the victim feel when this happened to them? So when we are trying to understand third-party behaviors, we are trying to utilize both of these capacities to understand and to make a moral judgment about the situation. So here is an item here's an example of a kind of harm that we're talking about. When we talk about assessing third-party moral evaluations. So here's the background. Frank is a dentist filling in the cavity of his patient. He must drill into the patient's tooth just above a major nerve. If the drill is used at a high speed, it will hit the nerve and cause excruciating pain. Now here's the belief. This is the theory of mind part, which is to figure out what was Franco thinking. Franco thinks that if he switches the drill to a higher speed, he'll dig the cavity without hitting the nerve below. And then we see what was the actual outcome. Frank switches the drill to a higher speed, hits the nerve, and causes the patient excruciating pain. Now, this is an example of accidental harm because the person didn't mean to do it, but they still ended up doing harm. Right, so you have neutral belief and a negative outcome, and this is also a kind of a dilemma that we have been talking about. It's a dilemma because there is no right answer if we want to think about a situation like this. Because on the one hand, we don't want to let the perpetrators go without any kind of blame or punishment because they didn't mean to do it, sure, but they also caused some kind of harm. And so what is interesting to us is try to figure out why is it that when faced with situations like this, some people would say, actually, we should forgive them, while other people would say, no, we should punish them. So we had predictions about brain structure and brain function. Our first prediction was that individuals who have more gray matter in the theory of mind network, which is the collection of brain regions which are involved in figuring out what other people are thinking, would be less punitive in their judgments of accidents, which makes sense, right? Because they focus more on what the person thinks, and therefore they're more likely to forgive accidents. But on the other hand, you also have the empathy network, and there we had prediction about function, which is that the more activity there is in the empathy network, the more people are going to focus on the harm caused to the victim, and the more more likely they will be to condemn the person who caused the accident. So first we wanted to figure out where the actual theory of mind network is for the participants. And for this, we used this classic mentalizing task, which is basically these figures who kind of dance in a certain way, which is not mechanical. Like there is some pattern to it, and then people have to figure out what these triangles are doing. This is the experimental task. There are also control tasks where the triangles actually just randomly move across the screen. Like there is no mind reading that you need to do. But here, as you can see, you clearly can see what's going on between these two. So using this task, like we can figure out which are the brain regions that participants are using to engage in mind reading, to figure out what other people are thinking, what their beliefs are, etc. And if we look at these brain regions, what we see is interesting. So here on x-axis, you have gray matter volume at a particular brain region, which is involved in figuring out what other people are thinking. And on y-axis, we have how severely people condemn accidental harms. And as you can see, people who have higher gray matter in this brain region are also less likely to condemn them. That is, they are more likely to forgive if there is more brain volume at the brain regions which are involved in thinking about intentions of other people, which makes sense because, like I said, the degree to which you want to focus on innocent intentions, the more likely you're to forgive accidental harms. Similarly, we also had empathy. We also wanted to figure out what's the empathy network for different participants. And here we used another task called empathy localizer task. I'm not sure if the video will run, so I'm not going to run it. But basically the task is you see people getting painful auditory stimulation, and these people react to them. And by looking at that, we can empathize. Of course, people empathize with this pain, and then we can figure out which are the brain regions which are involved in empathizing. And if we look at these brain regions, we also again see that the more activity there is in this network, the more likely are people to condemn accidental harm doers, because of course they are focusing more on the victim pain and not on the innocent intentions of the actor. So to conclude, when it comes to third-party evaluation, especially when we have to forgive accidents, there are two different psychological processes that are driving us in different directions. On one hand, we have empathy, where we empathize with the victim's pain and we want to condemn the accidental harm doer. But on the other hand, we also have theory of mind, where we figure out, well, the perpetrator actually didn't mean to cause harm, and then we want to forgive. And these two processes are pulling us in different directions. And that's why we feel conflicted when we have to evaluate accidental harms. This is also a good example to show how social neuroscience techniques like structural neuroimaging, functional neuroimaging, and in the previous study, we also use skin conductance data, how these methods, like these biomarker techniques, can help us figure out some truths about moral decision-making. So to give you an overall summary about these two parts, basically what we saw was different contexts. And the thing that was constant across this context was a dilemma, where different processes led us in different ways. So for example, in the first one, we have a conflict between our own welfare against someone else's. So it's an altruistic dilemma. In the second one, there is a conflict between forgiving the accidental harm doer versus condemning them. So it's a accidental dilemma. And in the third one, you have something like trolley dilemma, where we are thinking about whether it's ever okay to cause harm to few number of people if it means we will be saving a larger number of people from suffering. Now, across this different context, we have a dilemma and we have to solve this dilemma. And based on what I have shown you, we can say that there are two big factors in this. One are dispositional. The dispositional factors are basically personality traits, like how you score, how good are you at empathizing, how good are you at theory of mind, compassionate, etc. And you also have situational cues, where the situational cues are providing context for your motivational status. So what is motivating you in that given context? And these two factors can have impact on each other. And that gives you the final decision. So that's what decides, how would you be resolving the dilemmas that you're facing. And across this talk, of course, I have talked about only a small sample of my work because I don't want to overwhelm you with a lot of data. But in doing so, during my research, I have bridged multiple levels of analysis. So we have used self-report measures like questionnaires and vignette-based surveys. We have used performance measures like virtual reality or reinforcement learning tasks, where participants have to do something, while in self-report measures, they are just giving opinions about what they might do. We also have used clinical samples like neurodegenerative diseases and psychiatric disorders. We have used structural MRI measures, and we have used functional MRI measures. This is all to show you, like, technology has provided you with a lot of different tools that can be used to investigate how the human moral mind works. And by by using all these different methods, you can approach the same problem from different angles, and whatever the ultimate conclusion that you might draw should satisfy requirements of all these different levels. And that's all I had to say. And yeah, finally, I also wanted to say that, of course, this I've talked about like the morality in human beings. So, but all the lessons that we have learned from this are very much applicable to evaluating behavior of machines, for example. So, for example, if machines cause accidents, when we try to evaluate their behavior, it's an interesting question whether we will be using theory of mind or whether we'll be using empathy for the victims, etc. And so the lessons that we have learned from studying human morality are very much relevant to also studying machine morality. Thank you.